You probably play Infinite Impermanence as it's one of the 10 most played modern Yu-Gi-Oh cards in current memory. Probably more like top 3. On Yugioh, it's actually the second most played card this week. And if it weren't for Max C, it would probably see just as much play on Master Duel, but because of Max C, you have to play Ash Blossom, and Call by the Grave, and Cross Out Designator. In this video, I'm going to share 5 tips about the card, including ways to use it and avoid it being used against you. First, let's discuss the strengths of Infinite Impermanence over other hand traps you might play, or play in addition to. Then the remaining tips will be about the less obvious things regarding game strategy, as well as the specific wording on Infinite Impermanence that you may not have understood. Firstly, the strengths of Infinite Impermanence is that it is a trap card, so it doesn't play into either Triple Tactics Talent or Triple Tactics Thrust, or Called by the Grave, as it's not a monster card. In order to stop it, your opponent would have to play Cross Out Designator and their own Infinite Impermanence. It's not once per turn, so if you have more than one copy of it in your hand, you can use them all in the same turn. Unlike something like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion, or Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. Now, unlike Effect Veiler, Infinite Impermanence is a great 6th card, as you can use it on both players' turn from your hand. You might even determine that it makes more sense to hold on to your Infinite Impermanence, not even use it on your opponent's turn, just to use it against your opponent on their turn to turn off something like a Floodgate. Another advantage that Infinite Impermanence has over Effect Veiler is that it can be used during any phase of play, so you can use it to deal with something like IP Masquerena in the draw phase or the standby phase on your own turn, which is good because you have to have no cards in order to use Infinite Impermanence, and by the main phase you will probably have to start with a normal summon. Some of the weaknesses of Infinite Impermanence is that you can't use it from the hand if you control cards. So even though you can use all 3 copies in the same turn, if you use one, your opponent can chain Crossout Designator, calling Infinite Impermanence, and negating your Infinite Impermanence, making the other 2 copies useless. And you can't chain another Infinite Impermanence in response to the Crossout Designator because you currently control a copy of Infinite Impermanence on your field, so there is a card on your field, meaning you can't activate another Infinite Impermanence. On the other hand, if you had something like 3 Effect Veilers in your hand, you'd be able to activate one. If your opponent activated Called by the Grave or Crossout Designator, you can chain another one, so that the card would be negated before the Crossout Designator or Called by the Grave resolve. So Infinite Impermanence is pretty bad against Crossout Designator being played in the format. Because Infinite Impermanence is a trap card, even though you can activate it from your hand, it still must be played from your hand onto an open spell or trap card zone on your field. So if your opponent earlier in the turn activated something like Hot Red Dragon, Archfiend, King Calamity, which says you can't activate cards on the field, you still can't use it. Just because we call Infinite Impermanence a hand trap doesn't mean it can be activated in this scenario, because to activate a spell or trap card is to place it face up onto the field from your hand or to flip it up from being set. Once King Calamity is resolved, you won't be able to activate Infinite Impermanence. Also, because it goes onto the field, it's weak against something like Hot Red Archfiend Abyss, and it can be negated something like Beansmith Desiree. It can also be negated by another copy of Infinite Impermanence that's already negating a column, so you'll still want to be careful where you place your Infinite Impermanence if you're activating it from your hand, as the column may have already been negated. So you want to pay attention on Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel as to where the glowing blue bubbles and the green column are, to avoid playing into that column. Going first with Infinite Impermanence, you'll want to set it in columns your opponent is most likely to play into, assuming you choose to set it at all. If you manage to do your combo and not need to use your Infinite Impermanence, you might as well set it on the field so that it can be used during your opponent's turn. By default, you should probably set Infinite Impermanence in your center middle column, which is the most common place on Master Duel, a semi-automated simulator, that your opponent will activate their spells and trap cards into. So by setting yours in the middle column, if your opponent's not paying attention and they just play their cards into the middle, they will play into your Infinite Impermanence more often. But in real life, what I would make sure you do is pay attention to the players that you play with regularly and pay attention to what zones your opponents regularly play their cards into. So if you have to set more than one trap card, and you always notice your opponent activates a card in their second spell and trap card zone, maybe place your Infinite Impermanence there more often. Players will unconsciously use the same zones when they're on autopilot and aren't paying attention to the possibility of Infinite Impermanence. On Master Duel, this is harder to do as the column gets bubbly and easy to notice. After the centermost column, you'll probably want to use Infinite Impermanence in one of the pendulum zones, assuming you're not on a pendulum zone yourself and need to keep those zones clear in order to activate your pendulum spell cards. Although you can risk your Infinite Impermanence being in your pendulum zone if you suspect to be able to activate it on the next turn, and the effects of your pendulum spells is not relevant for your strategy, because scales are not negated by Infinite Impermanence. They will still have their numerical scale, still can be used for a pendulum summon even if they are negated. The reason for these placements, such as the center or the pendulum zones, is regarding the bonus effect of Infinite Impermanence, which states target one face-up monster your opponent controls, negate its effects until the end of this turn, which is then followed by the then conjunction, which means if you negate the monster that they control, the then effect applies, and the then effect is if this card was set before activation and is on the field at resolution, for the rest of this turn, all other spell and trap effects in this column are negated. To get the most value out of your imperms, you'll want to set it where your opponent will most likely be activating their spells and trap cards so that you can not only negate their monster, a spell and trap card in addition, if the scenario makes sense. Your opponent will likely activate their spells and trap cards on turn 2. To get the most value out of your infinite impermanence, you'll want to set it where your opponent will likely activate their spells and trap cards on turn 2 if you were to set it there on turn 1. Some cards, such as the Endymion Pendulum Scales, are played into the scale with the intent to summon themselves from the scale, and if they're negated, they'll get stuck there and they might have an awkward scale. So using infinite impermanence against a pendulum deck not only can negate a monster card, it'll prevent them from actually clearing their scale and creating a usable scale. Similarly, if you're going second, you can set your infinite impermanences in front of your opponent's set cards for their turn, if for some reason you chose not to use it to start your turn while you had no cards on the field. The weakness of that play is that your opponent's set card is probably also an infinite impermanence, as most trap cards are bad, and most people who play trap cards are playing infinite impermanence, or a Master Duel that may be a Call by the Grave. And if you predict that it is, you'll want to sequence your play lines, where if you both have them set in front of each other, that you'll come out on top of the exchange. So you might want to consider setting it away from your opponent's spell and trap card zones to ensure that your card is negated by their infinite impermanence. If your opponent had 4 cards set in their spell and trap card zones, it might be good to place your infinite impermanence in front of their only open spell and trap card zone so that if they top pick a spell card for the next turn, they have to activate it in that column, and it's most likely going to get negated, as the trap cards are already set, and you never knew which one was important anyway, whereas spells are almost always important, and you'll know exactly where it's going to get played. If they want to avoid your infinite impermanence, they may have to flip an already set spell or trap card, just so that it gets used to open up a space for them to play the next spell or trap card from their hand. One of the other things you can do with your infinite impermanence is to set it with another card, something like Trap Trick, Trap Track, or Lilith, Lady of Lament. I'm sure there are other cards that would allow you to set infinite impermanence in front of your opponent's cards after they set them. Well, they might have set them with the intent to avoid your cards, as in front of open spell and trap card zones. You can activate cards and place your infinite impermanence in front of theirs. You can set one with Lady Labyrinth of the Silver Castle. Any of those cards would be able to do it. But that way, when the turn passes back to you, your imperm is already in front of their spell and trap card, and you could just use your infinite impermanence to ensure that their spell and trap card doesn't work by negating a monster that they control. This is an interesting way of playing around the fact that your opponent may have set their card specifically where you could not have an infinite impermanence, whereas one of these cards would allow you to purposely put the imperm right in front of their card that they were actively avoiding. You do want to be careful when doing this particular play, because if you activate your Trap Trick and place your infinite impermanence into a column that's already included in infinite impermanence, even though you can still activate one trap card that turn, the imperm is now in an imperm column. You got to be careful about putting your cards into imperm columns with Trap Trick. This is because either player's infinite impermanence could have already been used on that column. So if you set a card into that column using Trap Trick, because you set it just now, you may forget that it's been already used as an imperm column. So be careful. Currently, due to the existence of cards like SP Little Knight, Forbidden Droplet, you may have to activate your infinite impermanence before a card is activated. Because if you wait for them to activate it, in response to your infinite impermanence, they might chain their SP Little Knight. So one of the weaknesses of this play is that the monster leaving the field hasn't been used yet, so if it were to be revived, such as a Snake Eye Ash with Promethean Princess, or a Samsara de Lotus being revived with something like Muckraker of the Underworld, or Opening of the Spirit Gate, the card hasn't used its effect yet, so it might come back and use its effect later. So you may have to preemptively use your infinite impermanence to make sure that the card can't be activated because of SP Little Knight, but they may get another opportunity to activate it by summoning the monster back later in the turn. This is already doable. Things like Forbidden Droplet, your opponent could activate their card that does something, and then when you try to imperm it, they can chain Droplet and send their monster to the graveyard. But preemptively utilizing your imperm might be necessary to make sure that an effect doesn't go off. There are actually ways of preventing the column negate of infinite impermanence from being applied. First, infinite impermanence uses the then conjunction, so you must negate a monster's effect in order to negate the column. This we've already discussed. But it also mentions that it must remain in that column at resolution in order to negate the spell or trap effects in that column. So a couple of ways to prevent the spell or trap card columns from being negated for the rest of the turn is you can use your SP Little Knight to help your monster dodge the negation, and if it dodges the negation, it will also dodge the spell or trap card column negate. But you can also flip your own skill drain to prevent your opponent from being able to negate your monster, as infinite impermanence cannot negate a monster that's already negated. While there are cards that can negate an already negated card, they have to be able to do something in addition to that effect on activation. So Forbidden Chalice negates a monster and gives it a 400 attack boost. Droplet negates a monster and halves attack. Both of those things can negate through a skill drain, but infinite impermanence cannot do that. If you negate your own monster with skill drain, infinite impermanence cannot negate the monster, and if infinite impermanence does not negate the monster, it does not negate the spell and trap card zone. You might want to preemptively negate your own card with skill drain, because if you have a monster that can tribute itself as cost, it's only negated by skill drain while it's on the field. You can use your Snake Eye Ash that's negated by skill drain by preventing it from getting imperm in order to remove your own skill drain from the field and summon your Snake Eye Oak or your Snake Eyes Flamberge Dragon. The last thing regarding the text of Infinite Impermanence is that it must remain on the field to negate the column. So Infinite Impermanence, Chain Droplet, sending the Imperm will prevent Imperm from negating the column. Also worth mentioning, if you have to play a card into a column negated by Infinite Impermanence, you can't activate a card into that column and then try to use Droplet to remove the card from the column, because Infinite Impermanence negates the effects of spells in the column, not spells in the column. So if you were to activate Raigeki and then chain Forbidden Droplet, sending the Raigeki to the graveyard in an Imperm column, the Raigeki will still be negated, as cards resolve where they activate, and it was activated into the Imperm column, so it resolves in the Imperm column, so it will still be negated by Infinite Impermanence. You can prevent your columns from being negated by removing the Imperm with something like MST. If your opponent activates an Infinite Impermanence to negate your monster, even if your monster is going to get negated, you can MST and destroy the Infinite Impermanence in their column, and it won't affect the column for the rest of the turn. Impermanence's negation is similar to Imperial Order rather than Skill Drain. Skill Drain only affects monsters that are on the field, whereas Imperial Order negates effects on the field. So if the effect activates on the field, it resolves on the field even if the card physically does not stay on the field. Unlike when I was talking about Snake Eye Ash, where it can tribute itself as cost, its effect is activated on the field, but the card is not on the field, so it's not affected by Skill Drain. And I know I talked quite a bit about Forbidden Droplet in this video, so click on this video for more information about Forbidden Droplet, and there will be a link to a video here on Skill Drain if that video is done. It may be appearing soon, pay attention for it. I'll see you guys next time.